SECfans.com. I'm going to talk a little bit about our computer model. We always have some questions every year when we get into the computer model. We don't start it until week 4. And so instead of sort of teeing it up every time, every game preview we do with an explanation of what the computer model is, we thought we'd make a video, put it out there for any time you want to refer back to this. It explains how our computer model works in detail. Obviously, on our website, SECfans.com, we'll have, like, for each game preview, we'll have a post that has the video of it linked to YouTube, and it has the audio. We'll also link the computer model for every one of these games. But to really know what's behind the numbers and what you see there and how we kind of operate statistically as a yards per play and not a total yards channel, we thought we'd make a video and kind of just explain what our computer model does. So Josh, why don't you get into it?
Our approach to modeling these games is really based off two ideas. The first idea is the best way to objectively measure a team's performance is based off what they do on an average play. And the second thing is that teams' performance are relative to other teams at different difficulty levels, so to speak, and based a little bit on style. Now, at least for the time being, we're a little limited what data we can use. So ideally, we'd be able to pull up full drive charts, and you can do some fancy stuff in SQL. That's what a lot of people do, but they do it to a different degree and really to a different end. If you looked at S&P Plus, which is one of the more sort of prominent statistical models, guys that I have a tremendous amount of respect for, at Football Outsiders and Bill Connolly, FPI is another one. They're all designed to take every team in the country, 1 through 130, and assign a rating. How good is your offense? How good is your defense? They have a lot of individual metrics that they create where they assign weight to efficiency is often a very big thing. You know, how often do you convert third downs? They look at explosive plays and use that as a rating. Then they create variables, which you have to do man-made and assign, and you say, okay, your overall rating is this much of your explosive rating, this much of your efficiency, this much of X, Y, Z. Come up with a single number. There's a problem in our view with this approach, and that is an overall rating doesn't necessarily translate across the whole spectrum of your possible opponents. S&P, which I referenced a minute ago, is based more or less off how you do against essentially an average Power 5 team. And what we've seen in college football is that spread offenses, and if you look at Jalen Hurts, or if you look at JT Barrett, those guys didn't do nearly as well against elite defenses as they did poor ones. And so if you compare, say, Ohio State or Alabama to, let's say in Indiana, a team that may beat Indiana by 40 may not necessarily beat another elite team by all that much, or may lose to them. Or to be even more specific, you might have, let's say, Cardell Jones, Ohio State from 2014, and you have JT Barrett, Ohio State from 2017. JT Barrett, Ohio State in 2017 will beat Indiana by 40 or 50 points. Cardell Jones, Ohio State, which we saw in 2015, would only beat them by 30. The problem is Cardell Jones, Ohio State does a much better job against elite teams like 2017 Ohio State. So if they played each other, 2015 Ohio State would probably beat 2017 Ohio State by quite a bit. Cardell Jones would have a much better game against an elite defense than JT Barrett would. And so our model is not built off giving a single rating 1 through 30. It's about saying, how good are you specifically against the team you're playing? It's all relational. And when you're playing an elite defense, we're looking at you and saying, okay, when you've played really good teams on your schedule, how did that affect you?
And the thing I like about our approach is, I think there was in the BCS formula, one of the computer models looked at scoring, and they talked about how 4 teams down the line, an opponent of an opponent of opponent, something like that, could impact the score. I think this might have been in 2007 when everything was all crazy, could impact your computer score and your BCS ranking based on how many points they scored. What I like about ours is we look at points scored as a function of yards per play. And so, what I'd like for you to do now is bring up a model, any model, and talk about how that, because there is some of that opponent of an opponent, at least two levels deep, how they do against other opponents versus how those opponents do on average. And so the concept of combining how we think a team's average run offense and run defense, pass offense and pass defense will do against their opponent relative to how they've done against other opponents, and coming up with kind of a yards per play contributing to a score instead of working from scores, which is kind of a total yardage sort of, misguided characteristic. Instead of working from a score backwards, it works from yards per play forwards to get you to a score. So why don't you walk through a model and sort of illustrate that in simplistic terms so we can show the model and sort of explain what's going on.
So the model we're going to look at is the model we ran in 2017 for Ohio State versus Penn State in the regular season. And the first thing we did with the model is we looked at it to figure out what was predicted yardage for each team. And we do that by saying, basically, Ohio State, when they played X team, what kind of an opponent average did they hold them to? In other words, if your opponent averages 4 yards a carry and you hold them to only 3 yards per carry, you hold them to 75% of their rushing average. Or if they average 9 yards per attempt and you hold them to 6 yards per attempt, you hold them to 66% of their pass average. Now, something we've seen quite consistently in college football, and I think it underlines a lot of points we'll make on the show, it's easy to keep a team to a low rush defensive a low percentage of their rushing average. It's really hard to keep them to a low percentage of their passing average. In other words, passing averages are a lot more consistent regardless of opponent defensive quality. Rushing averages vary pretty heavily with the quality of your opponent. So in this game, Ohio State had held teams to only 64% of what their rushing average was going in, but they'd given up 93% of their passing average. In general, we want to see, for an elite team or an elite defensive unit, is really below 70% of rushing averages, and anything below 80% in passing averages is pretty elite. If you want to say good, anything really sub 90% in rush averages is pretty good. Sub 80% is very good. That's when you have a genuinely good unit. Passing averages, anything below really 95 to 90% is solid. And you want to be in the 80s if you want to be a good pass defense. If you're not holding a team to 80 something percent of their rush average or passing average, you have a weakness in that area. And if it seems a little unusual to say, well, why are you saying 80% of their average? So you're saying if they get their average production, I'm a bad defense? The answer is yes, because teams play a lot of weak opponents, and those bolster everybody's statistics. So if you're holding them to their average, you're also filtering in there with all the UNLVs and the Akrons they play. You should do better than average if you're a good Power 5 team. In this game, what was interesting is that Ohio State, again, really good rush defense, but the pass defense at 93%, and we talked about this a lot in 2017, was a little bit suspect. Penn State not doing great against the run at 86%, but had a much better pass defense at 76%. The predictions that let us have was, okay, based off what you had done in the past, how you held their opponents to their averages, we're going to apply that to other teams. So Ohio State, if you hold teams to 64% of their rushing average going in, what does that mean for Penn State in this game? Well, we predicted Penn State would have 3.2 yards per carry, but we predicted they'd have 8 yards per attempt. Ohio State, because they were going up against Penn State, was a lot closer to their statistical averages in the run, 5.2 yards per carry, but would struggle passing the ball, 6.7 yards per carry. How did that turn out? Well, it wasn't particularly far off in a lot of ways. As predicted, Penn State could not run the ball, 2.6 yards per carry. We predicted 3.2. Anytime you get under about 3.5 yards per carry, it's so slim that it's hard to predict. But Ohio State's rushing production was dead on in this. We had predicted 5.2 yards per carry. They averaged 5.2 yards per carry, pretty much on the nose. Passing averages were a little different. Penn State struggled a little bit throwing the ball in this game, 6.6 yards per attempt. Ohio State had 8.84 yards per attempt, ended up being the deciding factor of the game. But it was the deciding factor, really interestingly, despite the fact of just how ineffective Penn State was. And that's the second thing I want to point out to this model, is that the model is also built to say, how effective are you scoring based off the yardage you get? Some offenses need a lot of per play production to score points. Grind out offenses like LSU's under Les Miles tend to need really high yard per play averages to score. And when that yard per play average falls anywhere really below 6 yard per play, LSU really consistently wouldn't be able to score. Our model will model that. It also models teams that are really good at scoring despite not having very much production. What was interesting about this game is Ohio State was expected to have 5.9 yards per play on average. Penn State was expected to have 5.5 yards per play on average. That's a weighted average of their run and pass average based off their run pass balance in the season. And even though Ohio State was expected to outgain Penn State in our model expected Penn State to score more on less yardage than Ohio State. And that's the thing I want to get across here, because that ended up proving very true. Ohio State did win this game 39-38. And now I know it was a really close game, kind of coming down to the wire. If Ohio State doesn't drive down and score at the end of the game, this actually ends up being pretty good. But the takeaway here is, what did this tell us about this team? So what was an interesting point? Well, the interesting point here was that Penn State was going to score more off less yardage. Ohio State outgained Penn State almost 2-1 in this game, and they won by 1 point. So the model was a good predictor in this game of the fact that Penn State was a lot more able to score. It was predicted that Penn State would not be able to run the ball. Penn State would be outgained by Ohio State, and that this would be an extremely close ball game, scoring in the 30s. All of those things came true. Now, we missed the winner of the game. We predicted but the model predicted Penn State 33, Ohio State 31. I will note my actual pick in the game was higher. I think if Penn State had successfully kicked a field goal, I would have had the exact score on the nose in my prediction. But what it was telling us and the data that came out of it was really useful and really on point. And that was, again, what were the strengths and weaknesses of each team? In this case, it was Penn State's not going to be able to run the ball, so they're going to have to rely on the pass. It's the fact that Penn State's going to have some big plays that generate points without a lot of production. And it's the fact that Ohio State was going to have a much more balanced offense. All of those things were true. And it's because we started with the per play production. We estimate how successful each team is going to be on a per play basis. And then we look at each team's own history, and we separately track that Penn State can score a lot more readily with less yardage than Ohio State can. So to be able to predict the fact that this was going to be a really tight game, even though Ohio State was going to outgain Penn State in the ball game. So long-winded, but that's the explanation of our model, and that sort of explains the good and the bad of it. It's not necessarily perfect, but it does give you useful data points as a baseline for going forward that we can use to sort of predict indicators for how a game's going to go.
And there's something else I want to touch on, because we are a number-driven channel and we use this model as a guide, but it generally, and we usually adhere to it pretty closely, especially as we get further into the season and we have more data. That is one of the limitations, that early on, the data is not necessarily great, but there are times where we deviate from the model. And one of the places we deviate most often is in predicting blowouts, where the model predicts blowouts pretty well. I think we do an even better job on the show of predicting blowouts where the model doesn't necessarily predict them. So combined with that and some of the screwy numbers we saw, because we're recording this in the first week of the model in the year, with some of the screwy numbers, talk about where the model sometimes gets it wrong, and what the core, maybe flaw there is in the data.
Models tend to be blind to certain things that basically they can't see, because either one, they don't have the data for it, or two, they tend to interpret the data the wrong way. One example is There was a point in 2017 where South Carolina was scoring more points with less production than they were with more production. They'd beaten NC State despite being outgained 2-1. And then when they got in games, they started moving the ball better, they scored less. The model we created, as I said, is completely self-generating in terms of it uses your own past performance to determine how your yardage should affect scoring and all that kind of thing. Well, because they've been more successful with less yardage than more, the model flipped everything on its head. And it said that the more yards that South Carolina gained, the less they'd score. And the less yardage they gained, the more they'd score. Obviously, that doesn't make sense, and it wasn't true. But it was seeing a trend there, probably in the fact that South Carolina was taking shots, so they were getting special teams plays because they didn't have much offensive production. And it felt like, it didn't have any way of knowing that that was a nonsensical result. So sometimes you have to temper it to say, there's a pattern of weird behavior here. There's some sort of noise in the system, or, maybe it even sees something there. Like there really may have been a scheme issue that changed when they lost Debo Samuel and played a more consistent offense that flipped things on its head, but it was still wrong. Obviously, South Carolina was not going to score more points with 1 yard per play than they were with 8. So sometimes you have to sort of look for a data point and temper it. And then in other cases, it can't see things like injuries and returning production. And again, we try to be as hands off as possible and use it as a baseline. And sometimes people will ask us, well, have you taken into account home field advantage, or have you taken into account injuries, or have you taken into account, yada, yada. The problem with all those things is I have to assign some variable to it and I have to give some weight. And for example, with injuries, I have to guess how much the replacement player is going to be as good or worse than the guy he, is replacing. A lot of models, S&P Plus's season preview model or their season predictor will use recruiting rankings. FBI will use recruiting rankings. But the problem is whoever creates the model has to sit down and figure out how much weight do I give recruiting rankings versus returning production. If I have a 3-star that's extremely productive and he's replaced by the number 1 player in the country at that position, is that player expected to be better than the guy that was productive the year before or worse? And how much does the seniority of that player matter? All those things have to be assigned variables. We're trying to keep our hands off it so that when we have our discussion, the model is a completely neutral observer. The only way to do that is for me, honestly, not to factor in injuries in the model itself. It also means we can't do things in the first few weeks of the season because we're always going to use only data from that season. It does mean, though, that sometimes we have to step back and say, yeah, the model's wrong because the model doesn't know X or Y happened. Case in point, in 2016, the model had Alabama winning 44-25 over Tennessee. Tennessee had just been gutted by injuries. They had really just struggled in recent games, even though to start the year they had been pretty good. The problem was, they lost Kirkland, they lost all their linebackers. They weren't the same football team they were at the start of the season. Now, our model can't see that. Our model didn't know that the football team it was looking at that had beaten Florida in September and beaten Georgia in October, and really, just lost in overtime to a top 10 Texas A&M team in 2016, wasn't going to resemble the team that was going to play Alabama. And they had lost in overtime to Texas A&M, again, because of injuries. They had a second half collapse. And we can look as a human being at that and say, okay, those players that all went out that caused them to collapse, that caused them to be completely incapable of stopping the run, that's a really bad sign going into the Alabama game. So the model looked at it and said, well, they played Florida close, Georgia close, Texas A&M close. They're going to be a solid team and keep this within a couple touchdowns. And we could step back and say, yeah, but if the model thinks that Alabama is a 20-point favorite in this game with the data it has, knowing the injuries, we're going to give Alabama 2 or 3 more touchdowns. And we very accurately predicted that game. I think my prediction for that was 41-13. And it ended up being 49-10, even worse than our blowout prediction. But again, that was giving weight to our model that even though Tennessee had played those teams close, it was still predicting Tennessee to be a 4-score underdog in that game. But still, we had to step back and give a few touchdowns one way or another, in this case to Alabama, because of the injury issues that the model just can't be aware of.
And over time, isn't it kind of true that injury stuff, the scheme stuff, the personnel stuff that's more of a soft target and not necessarily a data-driven target, doesn't that kind of get baked into the numbers over time and sort of make its way into the model as an aggregate data point?
It does. And one of the things we hear sometimes is people ask, well, do you model turnovers? Or, how do you account to turnovers? Do you give them points? No, we don't give turnovers their own points. And the reason is, again, the Penn State Ohio State example that we pointed out, Penn State scored more points than Ohio State did off the same yardage. Why is that? Because Penn State scored points off turnovers and Penn State scored points on special teams at a higher clip. If you can't kick field goals, if you don't generate defensive turnovers, that is going to lower your scoring output based off your yardage. And going back to the 2016 Alabama example, Alabama always had really high point production for their yardage, predicted for every game, because our model looked at it and said, whatever their yardage is, they get an extra score or two. And it understood that. It knew it. It baked it in. And you don't want to artificially sort of inject turnovers. You want to let it happen organically. You want the model to understand, injuries are creating a trend where your offensive production is dropping. And when your offensive production has dropped below a certain threshold, you're not very effective at scoring touchdowns, or in this case, just points. So it's that sort of organic production that you want to have. Our model bakes that in. It sees the fact that, again, when you're getting defensive touchdowns, or maybe you have real issues on special teams, or, what have you, it sees how that's affecting scoring. It sees how that's affecting your offense and defensive production and how that relates to points. And over time, those trends build in. Where the model is blind is, again, the Tennessee example. If you have a lot of injuries all at once, the model is looking at the whole season weighted equally. We found that is the most accurate way to do it because teams are too up and down. You want to take season averages, but sometimes big things happen. Sometimes the starting quarterback goes out injured and the backup's terrible. That kind of thing, the model isn't going to adjust fast enough to it. And that's where the human kind of has to step in and say, not so fast. These numbers don't quite make sense.
All right. So you got anything else on the model?
I don't think so. I think I pretty well beat it to death. And I'm sure there's other points to be had with it. But I think the simple takeaway from it all is it's designed to be a baseline. It's designed to say, if you play your B game and they play their B game, what does your B game look like compared to their B game? How many points do you both score? How much yardage do you both get if you both play your B game? Historically, based off your data. But basically, ignoring what you're going to do next weekend, the past 6 weeks average B game, what does that look like paired together? And I think the model does a very good job of telling you what the B game versus the B game looks like. And that gives you a starting point for a discussion. So you have some idea what the relative strength of those two teams are.
And that's it for for our model discussion, y'all. But I wanted to make a point here that we don't do a lot of gambling discussion on this channel. We do talk about point spreads, and we do leverage a computer model. And generally, computer models are used in the gambling space. We don't do a lot of it because we've seen how it can, numbers cannot tell the whole story, or we can get burned one way or the other. But what you just said there, Josh, and what I'm trying to tell people here is, we do this for y'all for a discussion on our channel because we like to be a numbers driven channel. So this is all kind of for y'all. I'm looking at the camera right now because this is for our discussion with you, and not necessarily for gambling. If you want to use it for that, great, but don't blame us if our model gets it wrong. So great discussion. I hope this goes a long way in explaining to everybody else, to y'all listening, to y'all watching every week, kind of how our model works. We'll keep this one up on the channel for as long as we have a channel. And if we're doing live shows now, maybe we can have a model discussion, nerdy discussion, one-on-one y'all later. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.